The latest. Thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. Today we are dissecting a semantic shift in global power. For decades, one phrase echoed through the corridors of power. France believed itself to be at the home in Africa for too long. But the laws haven't changed and the lease has expired. We are witnessing the final bitter stages of a geopolitical divorce from the streets of Bamako to the halls of the Elysee. The historic anachronism, French influence is crumbling. While Paris tried to keep the clock stopped in 1960, a new generation of Africa has woken up to globalized world where they are no longer the junior partners, but the masters of their own destiny. The backyard is gone. The pre-carré is finished. Today, we'll look at why the French flag is coming down and what this means for the future of African sovereignty. The French military presence in Africa used to be a permanent fixture, a silent guarantee of French interests. But look at the map now. Since 2022, French troops have been forced out of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and even Chad. The very place Paris thought was its most secured stronghold. Antonio Glissi hit the nail on the head. France's strategic failure wasn't just about losing battles, it was about arrogance. While thousands of French troops were stationed across millions of square kilometers in the Sahel, they were operating as if the local governments were secondary.
Est Bagayoko is with us first. Welcome to you. You are a political scientist and researcher, president of the African Security Sector Network, and a specialist in international security policies and security system reforms in West Africa, a region that particularly interests us, as we understood after this film in this program. Ousmane India is also with us.
Thank you.
Welcome to you. You are a journalist, former editor-in-chief in charge of Africa at TV5 Monde, and author of this book, Africa Against Democracy, Denial and Peril. It is a work available from Rive Neuve Editions. And finally with us, Antoine Lazare. Welcome, Antoine Lazare. You are a journalist, Africa specialist, founder and former director of La Lettre du Continent. We owe you, among others, The African Trap of Macron, From the Continent to the Hexagon. It is a book co-written with Pascal Hero and published by Fayard. So this film took us to former French colonies in Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Benin, and also Chad. And over there, what perhaps strikes you after watching this film, at first, is the past that does not pass. It's a past that does not pass. And this past is colonization. Does this explain for many the disaffection we are interested in today after this documentary?
Absolutely. The past that does not pass. In fact, France believed for too long that it was at home in Africa. It exported to a quarter of the continent. It exported not only its culture, its administration, its military, creating a little France for a period much too long. And at the fall of the Berlin Wall, that means around 89, 90, instead of reassessing things, it continued to act as if it were at home, somewhat disconnected from African realities. That means, unlike British colonization, where everyone was in their own club, with the worst being apartheid in South Africa, the best is precisely, that means the identity of African countries. It wasn't they didn't directly govern France with its tens of thousands of cooperants in Côte d'Ivoire in the 80s. There were still 50,000 French people. That means I really believe it's this way of having settled on this continent and not having understood. I see it from a historical perspective, a historical period. And I think the mistake was in 1989, 1990, France remained as if it were at home. While it was not interested in the Africa of Africans, it was not interested in African cultures, it was not interested in the real Africa.
And that's what she is paying for now.
What is also striking is that this past that does not pass is especially the case among the youth of the countries visited in this film. In other words, men and women who did not experience the period of colonization, nor the period of decolonization, which was particularly violent in some of these countries. We think of Cameroon in particular. That is particularly striking. who is orchestrating this?
So I think it is still important to realize that there is undeniably, as we can clearly see in the film, a rejection of France, but there is a much broader rejection of all traditional partners, especially European partners, including those who do not share the same colonial past as France. There is also a rather visceral rejection of multilateral organizations. The United Nations had to leave the region quite violently. So, yes, of course, there is this heavy legacy to bear, but I think it's a mistake to believe that the diagnosis should focus solely on this rejection of the colonial legacy. There is more broadly a questioning of asymmetric relationships, relationships perceived as domination of the North over countries of the South. And as France seeks to be extremely visible, especially on the African continent, claiming to have superior knowledge compared to its other European partners, it is the one facing the most virulent rejection.
And because you obviously mention other European countries that were also colonizers, we can obviously mention, as you did, Great Britain, the Belgians, of course, even the Germans.
For the Belgians, it's not easy. For example, today in Central Africa, especially in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, things are complicated. But we also see that, for example, the development policies of actors like the Germans or even the Scandinavian countries, which are generally perceived as easy partners without this heavy legacy, are becoming increasingly difficult for African partners to accept, who believe, as was rightly said,
that their local knowledge is not respected, and who they too are becoming ultra-sovereigntists. Usman Ndiaye, you share this analysis in full, in part. Perhaps some reservations to what was just said. No, I just wanted to focus on the youth, because it seems to me that it says a lot of things. It reveals a lot of things. One of the things that the youth reveals is that who grew up until the 90s in Africa, our consciousness, our political culture was built on many things from the world, on Palestine, on many things. Today, starting from the 2000s, I observed that the political culture was being built on the rejection of what we call the post-colonial order. That's what Antoine was describing. For example, our father's generation lived in a sort of more pervasive post-colonial continuation, and they did not contest it. And these are very concrete things. I'll give a very simple example. The University of Dakar, which is the great university of West Africa. After independence, it was dependent on the Academy of Bordeaux for a decade. So these are very concrete things. That generation in May '68 revolted to cut the ties. So when the colonial link was cut, in fact, it continued in a very pragmatic way, and it continued just into the 90s, in a sort of relative indifference. On the other hand, I think that the youth is waking up because one must not underestimate the consequences of policies from here. I think the world has globalized. Every political act, immediately with social networks, has an immediate consequence. For me, there are two very important turning points. 2005, Jacques Chirac, finally. I think it was under Chirac. They tried to get this law passed in France about the benefits of colonization. Afterwards, a few years later, the Dakar speech. And in fact, in those times, in that context, it is Nicolas Sarkozy's where he presents a backward Africa and all that. And that gave Attali an incredible mobilization. And it happened symbolically at the University of Dakar. So, we have a whole generation that built itself in terms of political reference with France. The Dakar speech attempts to rewrite colonial history. Or else, and this, we don't talk much about it, the repressive migration policies that are perceived over there today now, because the distance has shrunk. Everything that is done here has an immediate consequence. Last thing, we must note that those who carry this struggle, the most media-exposed faces of this struggle, they are not Africans who grew up in Africa. They are Africans who grew up here, who lived here, who French. In other words, it is the diaspora. Yes, for example, Kemi Seba grew up in Kemi Seba, who is one of the radicals of this movement, grew up in Strasbourg. And so, this recreates the link between the non-policy of contemporary here and what is happening with African youth. Now, there is one who wanted to position himself in rupture with all this. And moreover, this documentary was also worthwhile for an exclusive interview with the current head of state, Emmanuel Macron, about African policy. Moreover, he says that there is no African policy of France today. That he says it right at the beginning of the film. But he also tells us, look, me. I am the first French president who was born after decolonization. And so, he wants to break with his predecessors on this issue. Very clearly he says it again in this film. Is that the case? Since Macron's arrival at the Élysée, have we witnessed a change of course? A break with the past. Regarding the former French colonies, I think that Emmanuel Macron, he has still remained within this historical anachronism. It means he hasn't understood this past that doesn't pass. He believed that a bit like when we are children. We have a magic slate. He thought that by producing reports on colonization on Algeria, on Stora on Cameroon, on the Ramondi report and other reports, and Ravia obviously, on the Rwandan genocide, he thought that just like that, we were going to move on. There is a work of memory. But once again, first, he still had the attitude. The problem of France and also its institutions, meaning, it's the word of the head of state, and he showed it himself, particularly during the Barkhane military operations in the Sahel. He had such arrogance when he spoke to African heads of state. When he would tell them, yes, you are responsible for the death in relation to the families of French soldiers. You also had thousands of deaths among the soldiers. So there was still a whole attitude of, is it normal? I will be much shorter. When there is a locust that appears in the Sahel, it is considered to be France's responsibility. When you unfortunately have the Chibok girls, who are kidnapped in Nigeria students, Nigerians do not go and ask the British Prime Minister to take care of them. Is it normal? Still, in this period of Emmanuel Macron, whether he's in shirt sleeves at the Élysée, with maps of the Sahel behind him, showing him Operation Barkhane, what France was going to do, etc. It's also a kind of negation of local realities, of local disarmed troops. I'm not saying it's not good, obviously. It's true that it was Mali that called for the Operation Serval, which was still an operation. We're not going to contest it, but which made sense. But afterwards, Barkhane, putting 5,000 French soldiers on 5 million square kilometers. Afterwards, they reduced it a bit. When you think that the Americans, they had 100,000 men, in Afghanistan, over 600,000 square kilometers. It's the size of France. With 100,000 men, they didn't succeed. What about France? It's a bit of this kind of French pride. Thinking that we are still at home, in Africa, and we're going to manage the entire Sahel with our army. It's absurd, in hindsight. That's why I always talk about historical anachronism. We didn't understand that times. You're talking about a mixed record. There is, above all, France didn't see Africa globalize. France believed at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall that she was still at home. I can see the very ambassadors we see, Europeans. It's from the moment of the fall of the wall, not the fall of the Berlin Wall. When the French army got kicked out of the Sahel, you had all the ambassadors in Paris who wanted to talk about Africa, whereas before, they would go see the Africa advisor, the Africa director of the K, or the president's Africa advisor. It was, we asked France what should be done. You see a bit how we were in another historical period. Completely so, on the military front nonetheless. The observation is there, we are on the back foot. I don't know if we can use this term since 2022. Well, French soldiers have left 6 countries in West Africa and the Sahel, a certain number of which were obviously covered in this film. It's considerable. We only have 1 military base left, I believe, in Africa. Today, there are 2 remaining among those in Djibouti. And there is also a presence in Gabon. But indeed, it's in the wake of what Antoine Glazer just indicated. That is to say, the strategic operational failure of this Barkhane military operation, which was conducted in the Sahel, whose leaders demanded the departure. First in Mali, then in Niger, and finally in Chad. Which was a real shock. Because the French army has always considered that Chad was the country it could rely on most solidly. And subsequently Senegal followed very quickly. which was absolutely not concerned by Operation Barkhane, except for the transit of French troops and the transport of logistical equipment from French prepositioned bases. And finally, Ivory Coast. Is this French military presence? Denounced in this documentary by many. And this withdrawal of this military presence can contribute to rebuilding a history with this part of Africa. West Africa, Central Africa, where we were present in any case. It's the goal stated by the French authorities. There is a command for Africa that has been created, which aims to introduce new modalities of cooperation of partnership. More exactly, to use the institutional terms, which aim more to offer help, support in terms of intelligence. In fact, it's the only American model with AFRICOM that is more ad hoc, but which refers to AFRICOM. You just mentioned this name. It's the American military branch in Africa. It's the American military command in Africa, just like CENTCOM is the American military command in the Middle East. In any case, the problem is that these new forms of cooperation are not as unprecedented as some would have us say. It is in particular about offering a much more regional offer and less focused on bilateral partnerships. But in reality, we realize that it's already been about 20 years that French military cooperation had already used this type of response.
Today, the reality is clear. France was not withdrawing. It was being evicted. The vacuum and the new place, nature and geopolitics. As the French tricolor comes down, the flags are rising. But don't be fooled into thinking this is just a replacement of one master for another. Russia, the African corps. Unlike the permanent French base, Russia is deploying Praetorian guards and security contractors. They aren't building administrations. They are protecting leadership and securing mines in exchange for military support. China, the economic giant. While France was stuck in the past, China was building the future. With over $295 billion in trade, China is now the top commercial partner for the continent. They aren't just selling goods. They are investing in the new frontier of mining, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals that the world needs for the next century. The rise of sovereignty. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré and the heads of the Sahel Alliance are proving that Africa is no longer a passive player. They are engaging cynical diplomacy, playing the West against the East to maximize their own national interest. The era of the backyard is dead. We are entering a multipolar world where African nations are choosing their partners based on respect and mutual benefit, not colonial history. The economic divorce. It isn't just about guns and soldiers. It's about the money. It's about the power. It's about the strength. The African is proving to the world that we are no longer ready to have masters. We have had masters enough, yet there is nothing that came out of it. So we want to manage our own affairs. Like our Pan-African leaders rightfully said, the African is capable of managing his own affairs. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah didn't miss his voice, and he knows what the African is capable of. So, today, even the French people are telling it straight to Emmanuel Macron that their old games in Africa is long dead. Macron is not seeing top because his own people are giving him fire. They are rising against him, making him to understand that the old ways of doing things is over. Coming into Africa and making us look as if we do not have a voice over our own future is something that these people were making a great mistake. They believe strongly that Africa will never rise up, will continue to be the obedient ones. But no, Time has come and we are rising to let the people know that the African is capable of managing his own affairs and will not continue to salute forever and ever. We deserve what we have, and the resources that are here are not meant for any other person but ourselves. And we will not allow other people to treat us as second-class humans. The time for us to prove to the world that we are capable is now, and the leaders in the Sahel are doing perfectly that. France is restless because their safeguard, their abode, their heaven, their trusted place has been taken away from them. They never saw this coming because nobody believed that the African will ever rise to fight for his or her own freedom. They believe will continue to be under their mercy, to salute them and always do as they say. But the time has come that we are proving to this world that these things are not going to continue to be the same. We are no longer going to allow people dictating the fate of the African. We are the only ones that can set ourselves free. United we stand, divided we fall, and united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we'll make Africa great for ourselves and the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world in Europe and in France.